Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ms. Pritzker, for joining us today, for answering these questions. Thank you for coming by my office this week and visiting. I enjoyed the chance to visit.
Me too. Thank you.
Let me say at the outset that in a bipartisan note, I want to echo the comments that Senator McCaskill just raised about looking at the SES bonuses. I think that's an area that additional close scrutiny is certainly warranted. I'd like to begin by talking about a topic you and I talked about in my office, which was free trade. Mm-hmm. And in the course of that conversation, as I understood what you said, you said you were an enthusiastic, unapologetic advocate of free trade. Is that a fair characterization? And if so, would you elaborate on your views, please?
Well, Senator, I am a believer that trade agreements can be advantageous for American business, and so I am, if I'm confirmed, would look forward to working with our U.S. trade rep to expand our trade agreements so that our businesses and can grow and grow their employment population. I think that, and create jobs for people in this country, good jobs. And so I'm hopeful that the European trade negotiation and that with Asia can be something that, if we could get a good agreement, can be good for American business and good for American job creation.
Well, thank you, Ms. Pritzker. As I shared with you, I have been disappointed that, in my judgment, the current administration has been less than vigorous in pursuing free trade. And if you are confirmed, I hope that you will be an effective voice for making the administration far more vigorous going forward. A second area that we talked about that I'd like to discuss is the area of regulation. And as you know, my top priority in office is restoring economic growth in this country.
Yes.
I think that is the most critical element to ensuring our long-term strength and to also expanding the opportunity in this country for the least well-off among us to climb the economic ladder and to achieve the American dream. And we talked quite a bit about the impact of overly burdensome regulation and how that can harm businesses, and especially small businesses that are just starting and struggling, and that, as you know, generate 2/3 of all new jobs. Yesterday, in confirmation hearings in this room, the nominee to be Secretary of Transportation, I had a similar conversation with him and asked him at the time if he would commit in his first 100 days to working to identifying at least 3 regulations that are overly burdensome, and to working with me and with this committee to either modify or repeal those. And indeed, his response, I will confess, I liked very much, in that he suggested that 3 might not be enough, and then he suggested instead 10, which I accepted that as a friendly amendment. And so I would ask you the same question, and if you would make the same commitment.
Well, Senator, you and I had this conversation, and I think agree, as does the President, that it's extremely important that we look at our regulatory environment, which has become where we put regulation on top of regulation, and see how can we streamline regulation so that it's effective, but also so that businesses can grow, can be innovative, and can create jobs and economic growth, as you said. So I'm, enthusiastically would look at the Commerce Department. I'm not sure the regulations in the Commerce Department are as vast as the regulations of the Transportation Department, but enthusiastically work with the organization to find opportunities to streamline regulation.
Well, terrific. I appreciate that. You also suggested in our conversation the concept of zero-based regulation, that rather than piling one regulation on another and it continuing to grow vast and unwieldy, that we ought to start from a zero base and ask what regulation is needed. and sensible. I very much agree with that notion, and so I would welcome if you would perhaps elaborate on the concept as you shared when we visited.
Well, in business, one often is required to start again, if you will, or look at the situation and, if you will, taking the concept of zero-based budgeting and then say, let's take a fresh look at the situation. And I think that would be, I think that's what the President was getting at with the executive order, was to try and say, look, let's look at the cost-benefit of what we've got, but let's streamline our regulatory structure. And a zero-based idea is basically start from scratch and say, what are we trying to accomplish here with regulation, and how do we do that most efficiently and effectively? Now, precisely how one accomplishes that here is not something I'm expert at, but I look forward to learning and trying to help with that effort.
Well, very good. I look forward to working with you on that, and I hope that if you're confirmed that you can provide a voice in this administration for pulling back the regulations that I think are so damaging economic growth and killing jobs and really impacting in a negative way a great many Americans who are struggling. The last topic that I want to discuss very briefly is the topic of spectrum. And as you know, right now the vast majority of usable spectrum is either owned or shared by the government, 60 to 70%. And last year's Spectrum Act statutorily requires the NTIA to, quote, promote the best possible and most efficient use of electromagnetic spectrum resources across the federal government. In my view, federal government ownership of assets, be they spectrum, be they land, or anything else, should be the minimum necessary to protect our critical national interest. And spectrum in particular, I would like to see as much of it as possible placed in the private sector rather, to allow entrepreneurs, to allow businesses to put it to productive use, to generate economic growth, to generate jobs. Do you agree with that approach? And would you agree to work together to try to assess just how much spectrum the federal government needs and how much of that can be sold at significant profit to the government, to the private sector, to be put to productive use for private Americans?
Well, Senator, I support the President's goal of having, he is, I think, tasked the agencies to look for 500 megahertz of spectrum. I think having, and the NTIA to date has found 100 megahertz of spectrum to make available for commercial use. I support the effort of finding as much spectrum as is possible to be used for commercial use, balancing, of course, our national security and other needs, if you will. And that's something that, if I'm confirmed, I would work closely with the head of NTIA to really make sure that we find that spectrum.
Very good. Thank you, and I look forward to our working together on all these issues.
Senator, I look forward to it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator, very, very much.